was really an accomplishment because he's trying so.
In the previous video, Dr. Tomlinson introduced the concept of strength-based assessment that focuses on identifying students' abilities rather than weaknesses. In this presentation, Dr. Tomlinson will continue her presentation on assessment and will conclude with an explanation of flexible grouping and how it can ensure the effectiveness of a differentiated approach to instruction.
Strength-based assessments kind of stack up like this compared to typical ones. I want you to think about kids that you have where we get this kind of school data and you have a kid who's sort of average in his aptitude or achievement, reading about on grade level, of a little above average in math computation, missed 10 days of school this quarter, had 2 in-school suspensions. And if you're a normal human being and you get this on a kid, what are you thinking? Has some potential, a little off course, going to cause a little problem, things aren't working too well. When you get the strength-based stuff, likes mechanical things, reads magazines about motorcycles, want to learn more about computers, seen as a big brother to kids in the neighborhood, wants to travel someday and likes to talk about ideas. How do you feel about teaching that kid? That's a pretty interesting human being right there. And I don't feel discouraged anymore. So it's not that that's the be-all and end-all, but I do think that notion of encouraging kids to think about their strengths and share them has something going for it. There are a ton of ways that we can do pre-assessments and ongoing assessments, and my guess would be that you guys have invented another 10 others that could probably go up here. Not an exclusive list, but let's look just at a few quick things that teachers can do to assess. This thing's called a Freyr diagram, and it would be a perfectly good pre-assessment to use just this at the beginning of a unit for a whole year. Here is the topic or the concept that you're going to be studying in the next unit. And in a standard Freyr diagram, you ask kids, so define a fraction for me. Give me any information you have about fractions. Can you give me some examples of fractions? And what are some non-examples? A non-example is something that's close but no cigar. You wouldn't draw a picture of a truck up here and say a truck is not a fraction. But a decimal, people could get that confused with a fraction. A whole number, sort of like a fraction. Fractions are part of it, but it's not really a fraction. A percentage is sort of like that. You could draw a whole picture of a box that had 3 parts in it and put fraction beside that, and then the whole box and do not fraction. You'll find some kids can give you a little here, but not this. Maybe somebody can do this, but not this. It gives you a sense of where they are. And if a week into your unit, or 2 weeks in, you give this back to kids and ask them to do it as an ongoing assessment, what benefit might that have? It's very clear to them, oh, that's that thing he gave me when we started the unit, and I wasn't very good at that. I left a lot of it off, but now I can do a lot of this better. I'm sort of starting to see, and it's helping build that framework again. Point of an ongoing assessment is not to grade it. It's for you to see where the kid is so you know how to move them on better. Whatever your topic is, concept is, can go there. Exit card. In a science class, teacher's been talking with kiddos. Maybe they've done some drawings, looked at a science video, watched an animation from the internet, and 5 minutes before the class is over, teacher gives them an index card and asks them to do these 3 things. Draw the orbit of the Earth around the sun with labels. What causes the seasons? Why is it warmer in winter than in summer? Get that stuff. You can. The point of the index card is the kid's not going to have long to write. You're not going to have long to read. You can tell if they've really nailed it, if they're clueless, or if it's beginning to take shape but hasn't yet. Let you know who needs what tomorrow. Another exit card. This one's kind of nice and open-ended, sort of what should we really know? What really matters about the greenhouse effect? By the way, if you're just teaching facts, the kids don't know that. If you're working with the big ideas, it's clearer. I think this is helpful too, to put on an exit card sometimes. So what's bothering you? What are you still uncertain of? I like this one. This is an exit card that has not to do with readiness or understanding, but how the kids are learning in class. And the teacher just said, in this lesson we've been doing for the last couple of days, we've used 3 strategies. We've used a 3-minute pause, we've used a think, pair, share, and we've used visualizing. Which of those strategies seem to work best for you, and why? What's the point of asking the kids if your lesson plans are working? You really need to adjust not just whether they're getting the stuff, but the way you're sharing the stuff is working. And can you see this moving to assessment for learning, as learning, so that the kids are having to be aware and analytical of what's going on in the classroom? He did 3 things for us this week, and this one really clarified because this happened, and this one I hadn't done before, but it was pretty cool, and this one I hate it when we do this, and here's why. And it establishes more of a partnership with the teacher. This is one of my favorite ones because of the sort of history that I've had with it. I first encountered a windshield check here in Virginia with a teacher who had a very mixed ability classroom. She had kiddos who were identified as gifted, kids with learning disabilities. She had regular old Joes, whatever that means. She had kids with ADHD, a couple of kids with learning disabilities. And she had a very large group of students who had failed the state standards test for 5 years before she got them. And the principal gave them to her because she was a tough old bird, but she was also a compassionate tough old bird. And as it turns out, that's a good mixture for kids. They tell us that when kids are really disenfranchised from school, you need what research calls warm demanders. I've always thought of them as half Mother Teresa and half pit bull. And Edie was half pit bull. You didn't mess around in her class, but she was also half Mother Teresa. She was accepting and warm with the kids. And in fact, she called that group of kids who had failed the state standards test every year, anytime she referred to them, she called them the kids who need a lot of love. She never referred to them as the kids who can't pass the test. She always talked about them as the kids who need a lot of love. Well, Edie had done lots to differentiate, and she had used many kinds of assessments, including exit cards and Freyr diagrams and journal prompts. And one day she said to the kids, and this is moving to assessment as learning as well, she said, you know what, guys, I kind of keep checking to see where you are so I can do a better job of teaching you tomorrow, but here's what I think. I think you're old enough to know yourself how you're doing. And I don't think I have to ask you every time how you're doing. I think you can tell me. And so every once in a while, here's what we're going to do. So you get to have a voice in how things are going for you. We're going to study something, share it, talk about it, do some examples. And then I'm going to say, okay, guys, time for a windshield check. And here's how the windshield check works. Let's assume we're here in Virginia and we're driving to Chicago. And you have 3 choices for answers on that windshield check. One is, Ms. Marchese, I get this. My windshield is clear. I can see all the way to Chicago. Please quit teaching it to me. I've already got it. Second choice is, you know, my windshield's pretty good, and mostly I can see where we're going. But as we've been talking the last couple of days, I think I hit a couple of bugs, and I got a couple of splats on the windshield. What that means is mostly I get it, but I'm a little confused about a couple of things. Need a little more practice. Third choice is somehow as we were driving today, I hit a mud hole, and my windshield's pretty well coated. And that means, sorry, ma'am, you just lost me. I don't know what to do next. I don't understand why the kids around me know how to do what they're doing. So she would do a windshield check, and she'd say, okay, guys, we've been doing this particular operation in math. Let's try a windshield check. And the kids would raise their hands, and she'd say, if you've got bugs, go over here. If you've got mud, go here. If you're clear, go here. And she had things prepared for them to do. She just didn't know who was going to pick which one. A couple of weeks, 3-4 weeks into windshield checks, one day she was teaching away, and a little kid raised his hand, and he said, Ms. Marchese, we don't think we're all in the same place anymore. We think we need to do a windshield check. Funny thing was, he had not talked to another kid because they'd been doing something together for 20 or 25 minutes. He just didn't want to say, I'm feeling really stupid here. Could we stop the train? So he said, we think we need to do another windshield check. And she said, you know, that's great. I shouldn't be the only one that decides when it's time for a windshield check. So if you guys get to the point one day where you think a windshield check's a good idea, you just let me know, and I'll give us one just as soon as I can get to that point in a lesson. So she divided them up, and they did their thing. At the end of the year, her students did amazingly well, achievement-wise. And again, she taught with a concept base, she differentiated, she used assessment constantly with the kids. But she said to me, you know, Carol, I think the thing that made the most difference for the kids, of all the things that I did, was the windshield check. Why do you suppose she thought that was so powerful? You'd have seen lots going on in her class, differentiated contracts, tiered lessons, interest-based things. Why this?
Students took ownership of their learning.
That's a huge one. They took ownership of their learning. They're having to say, I am or I'm not getting it, and they're not puppets anymore. They're becoming more metacognitively aware. What else? Yeah.
She was actually able to address when they had met on their windshield. She could actually address that at the time, and it wasn't just skimmed over, and they didn't slip through the cracks. And then those that were clear, she was able to extend their learning to take it above and beyond.
Yeah, she said one of the things that made such a difference is they never got far ahead of me or behind me before I found out. We didn't waste 3 days with a kid getting more confused before I found out that she was confused and could do something about it. I didn't have kids sitting and waiting for 5 days for me to teach something they already knew. I could make the adjustment right there. I've since had that exact same story told to me by 2 other teachers, a high school teacher who does what she calls a dipstick check with her high school kids, and their choices are my tank's full, my tank's half full, or I need oil. But what was interesting to me was she said exactly the same thing. She said, I can see my students' achievement moving up since I've done this, because we don't get days away from their problems before I know what I need to address. And last summer at our institute, a primary grade teacher said she did exactly the same thing in her classroom, except they call it a weather report because weather is one of their big units in that grade. And their choices are sunny skies, a few high clouds, and fog and smog. She teaches here in Virginia, and in her very interesting school, she had both the lieutenant governor's child in her class and about 50% of her class on free and reduced lunch. So she had a great diversity of student need. And she said exactly the same thing. My experience has been that since I started the windshield check, their achievement is better than it has ever been because I'm right on top of the needs they have. So that proximity to the kids' needs and the students' ownership and partnership in learning makes this one particularly powerful. Hilda Taba said, teaching in the dark is questionable business. And I sort of hate that quote, because I taught in the dark for a really lot of years. I just taught those lessons, made those lessons, went in, taught those suckers the best way I could, had no sense at all of whether anybody was going with me. And of course, like the agriculture lady, lots of them I had lost at square one. A really tough thing in a 3-day thing like this with a very little time in the morning is there are about 8,000 things it would be nice for us to explore and watch in action, and we sort of end up with a revised condensed version of whatever. But a major principle of differentiation that's not one of the ones that's here just because everything can't be is the notion that good differentiation is proactive, pre-planned. Most of us, when we differentiate, much of the time do reactive differentiation. We take in one set of stuff for everybody, and then when it doesn't work, we try to improvise. And you can't improvise in a situation like this very well. You might improvise with the group you're going to sit down and talk with first, but if you don't have anything for those other 2 groups, you can't do anything with the first one. So it sort of takes anticipating, although it's not terribly hard. Even in a book, there usually are thought questions that are more extensive or problems that are more, application exotic or whatever that you can use to extend ideas. And when you're going to sit down with a group to reteach, that frequently is something that comes in the classroom with the teacher. If they're not getting it, why, and what's another way I can approach that? If it didn't work yesterday, you really don't need to keep trying it today. You need to try a new way to kind of come at it. But you have to have something for that group that's ready to just practice some more. And so sort of proactively saying, so what will I do today when I discover that somebody's ahead or needs a little extra time? And that proactive piece makes all the difference. When we look at little pieces, and it sometimes makes us breathe easier if we can look at a week instead of just a moment. If I've really got this thing right, I'm going to meet with different kids at different times. And when I'm meeting with that group that needs my help right now, I'm going to do that for 5 or 10 minutes, and then I'm going to leave them with something to do and go sit down with other kids. And then I'm going to leave them with something and go sit down with others. And then I'm going to come back again. And I'm going to try to ask myself during the week, is there a group that's getting more of my time and another group that I'm leaving out all the time? And if that's the case, how can I make adjustments to get to different kids in different ways? So it's that part of thoughtful reflection, but what matters most is the question, the image in your head, which is not a good one, of one group that always has the teacher, whether that looks bad or good, and other groups that don't, whether that looks bad or good. Everybody needs you. Your brightest kids cannot grow until you give them something they can't do. And as soon as you give them something they can't do, they're absolutely as needy of you as your kids who are really struggling. If every kid has something that's a little too hard for them, every kid needs you. Okay, I want to look at this just really quickly with you, in part because of the question that was raised a little while ago about schools where we're still splitting kids out, which, by the way, will be with us for a while, I'm sure. Flexible grouping is, again, a really critical element of good differentiation, because if you don't do it, you end up with bluebirds, buzzards, wombats, fixed mindset, lack of respect for kids, teacher's pet kinds of things. And if you have a group that's based on readiness, it needs to be based on very current pre-assessment or ongoing assessment data. What I mean by that right now, in my opinion, a not very good spin-off of No Child Left Behind is that many school districts are doing these constant testings of kids, and it keeps generating data. And somehow that's supposed to help us, but a standardized test is not anything like as accurate as your observation today of where a kid is today. And that standardized test can't really align that tightly with your curriculum, because things have to waffle in the classroom. So we need to be putting kids in readiness groups when we use those, which should only be part of the time, based on the most current, most aligned data that we've got, which is likely to be ongoing classroom assessment data, more so than the standardized test data. Take a look at this for just a second. And based kind of on what we've been talking about with teacher respect with kids, connecting with kids, expecting all kids to do things that are thoughtful, what would you say to Ms. Jacobs about her work with kids in her class? What do you think?
There's no flexible grouping, there's no really teacher assessment, and you're not really, it's not really a good indication of who the students are and where they are, and at some point there's growth, and you're not accounting for growth or a student who's struggling.
Yeah, there are a lot of things with this that I think are kind of tricky. When you look at a standardized test score and you say, okay, that's who this kid is, and that's who this kid's going to be all year, or even all quarter, or all semester, you got a pretty fixed mindset there. A better notion is, okay, that's who that kid was sometime in the past, watch me change them. When you get a kid and lock them into something like that, it's pretty static. And it's also working with the notion that the past is the future in some way. Doesn't want much flexibility here. What she wants is ease. And if I plug them in once, what you really are doing here, guys, is sort of tracking within the regular classroom instead of tracking outside the regular classroom. Now, if I had a choice, I'd take tracking in the classroom rather than tracking outside for some reasons we'll look at in a minute. But this is pretty fixed. This is actually a school I watched in North Carolina, a set of classes, and I didn't know what I was getting ready to see. Some teachers had just asked me to come in and observe their math classes because they were differentiating. They had worked very hard on the differentiation, understood a good bit about differentiation, and they just wanted some feedback, which I always think is a great sign, you know, when teachers say, come in and what else can you help us do to get better? These very good teachers. And when I got in, I just went into a classroom. Nobody said, here's the nature of this class, or here's how we're differentiating. I just went into a classroom. And in the first classroom, my first thought was, you know, this is a teacher who took some time to prepare this lesson. She had big tubs of water in the classroom and big tubs of sand and rocks. And she had all sorts of containers that kids were dipping and measuring and weighing with, several scales. And the kids had a number of tasks that they were working on to use the materials to get weights and measures. And so my first thought was this teacher didn't just hand out worksheets. She really has the kids doing hands-on stuff. And I'll come back to that group in a minute. I went into a second classroom, still didn't know what I was looking at. Class was studying weights and measures, essentially the same sorts of skills. They were skill-based lessons, about the same skills. And when I listened to that teacher, my first thought was, this is a teacher who really knows her content. She was having a discussion with the kids. She was giving them problems to solve. She was talking knowledgeably. She was confident with what she was doing. And just like with the first teacher, I thought this is somebody who really has prepared for this. Went into the third classroom and watched this teacher give the instructions for the zoo and tell the kids that the deal was they had this area for a zoo and they had different animals assigned to them, and they had some information about how much food the animals ate and how much square footage per animal they needed and the amount of water that was necessary for them. But the zoo was a little small, and the deal was that everybody had to argue for the maximum they could get for their animals so that their animals didn't really get short-shrifted with space or food or water. And then there was this really annoying parking lot that had to be built because people had to come to the zoo, and so they had to figure out that parking lot thing there. He gave the kids the directions, and they sort of went off to work. Now, if I just left you with that definition, it sounds pretty good because you've got three teachers who are well prepared. Nobody that's sitting there just doing, fill out the worksheet, go to the back of the room and check it. And they're all working with the same essential topic. My first thought was, she's prepared this lesson. My second thought was, this is the deadest group of kids I've ever seen. They're measuring that sand going. Then they'd go get the water. They were working in pairs and they didn't even talk to each other. And I thought, what's that about? Because I wouldn't hate measuring those rocks and things. I wouldn't mind that. And I went to the second class, and clearly the teacher knew her content. And in essence, what the kids were doing was problem solving out of the math textbook. She was talking with them about it, but it was problems from the book. They were very dutiful about what they did. They asked reasonable questions occasionally. It wasn't as dead as the first class, but it was pretty still. What do you suppose it was like in here? You would have thought the giraffe was coming in that room in a minute. Those kids were talking. They couldn't wait for him to finish the instructions. Once they got the drift, they were ready to go, and they were boogieing around that thing, and we got to get so-and-so from them. They're going to try to hog this because of, here's what we're going to have to tell them. Here's the case we're going to make. And what had happened in that school was, and this is fairly common, teachers decided, okay, we're going to assess the kids, and we're going to take the kids who can't do math and give them all to this teacher so she can work with them in a slower, steadier, hands-on way. And she was good with what she did. So what was wrong in that classroom? Why was everybody so dead?
The kids probably knew if they came from other classes, they probably had talked to their friends who were getting to do the Zoom.
So there's three classes squashed together, three rooms that have been resorted for math. In other words, room A, room B, and room C are separate homerooms. And when it comes to math, all the kids who can't do math from A, B, and C go to that first room. All the kids who are about grade level with math from A, B, and C go to the second room. And all the kids who are really good with math go here. Now, as it happens, interestingly, this was the first day of the unit. So the kids here did not know what these guys were getting ready to do. 2 days from now, that'll be a problem. But what's their problem right now?
They don't have anybody else maybe that likes math to show them that it's fun.
You think the kids know who's dumb?
Yeah.
That everybody thinks is dumb? They're looking around in that classroom, and what's the message? Here I am again with the zeros. Here I am again with the kids who can't do math. They're giving us stuff to measure sand. So instead of looking like something that was wonderful to them, and I thought it was a good lesson, I really did, but somehow they were interpreting it negatively, or they were so lethargic about themselves, there was just no life. These kids were doing math as usual. They had a knowledgeable teacher. She was demonstrating, they were figuring out, they were doing things in the book. It was math as usual, and it felt like math as usual. These guys were so psyched about the application of math that math was about the coolest thing in town. Could you possibly have put these kids in groups, even if you wanted to mix A, B, and C some, so that everybody's doing this, but with different support systems and different roles, and times to sit with the teacher to go back and look at some computations that you might not understand if you need to, and to come back in and be fed into that? What I really wanted to do with those teachers was to say, you know, this is the perfect place to try this. You are all really smart teachers. You really know your stuff and you're willing to work. Let's take this thing and put it in all 3 classrooms and then sit down and figure out how to differentiate to support more kids in getting there, and to be very sure that these advanced kids have stuff to do within that context that continues to push them even further down the pike. Here's my answer, not the answer. There's no an answer to anything in education, but we have a glob of research on tracking kids, grouping kids. We just don't have, I mean, if we've got this much research on tracking and grouping, this much of it says it doesn't work for much of anybody. And then there's a little piece that says maybe it does for a few kids. But even the piece that says maybe it does for really bright kids has a counter piece that says when you do that with those kids, you get this fixed mindset thing, which becomes destructive in these ways. And a series of studies called Big Fish and Little Pond studies that suggest that really, because of that severe competition and that sense of this is who I am and I'm supposed to be successful all the time, that kids really do lower their sights for themselves, that they really don't develop confidence, that they're much more likely to cheat in situations, do anything to avoid failure. Many of the studies that say that bright kids learn better in non-group situations only studied 2 things: how they do in a group situation where somebody has curriculum that's appropriate for them, and how they do in a non-group situation where there's nothing appropriate for them. There is not a body of research that has looked at much at what happens to those kids when they're in a mixed setting with appropriately challenging curriculum. It's only a very small beginning emergent batch of that. So, and here's the other piece. You guys are always responsible for that group of 30 kids that you've got Monday morning. But somebody, leaders somewhere, have to be responsible for the big picture. And in the big picture across this country still, when you go into classrooms to look, this class is going to have way more poor and minority kids in it. And this class is going to be almost exclusively white and middle class. Nothing wrong with being white and middle class. A fair number of us are white and middle class. It's not a bad way to live. It's just that the rest of the universe is out there too. And the trick is to do what these guys need to do without short shrifting these. This group of kids is growing rapidly. Second language learners, low income kids, fastest growing groups in our country. This group getting smaller. 20 years from now, if we still have track classes where the largest set of the population has a low expectations curriculum, the implications for our country are huge. So the question is, how do you get from point A to point B? And I can tell you one way you don't get there. You don't go back and announce tomorrow we will have no grouping on Tuesday, because you make teachers crazy and nobody's equipped to deal with the issues. Where it works is when you get teachers who work with leaders in schools to get ready to do something different, and that can make the difference. Okay, I want to switch here for just 1 second. I'm going to try to do this expeditiously, but I want to end instead of just quitting with you if I can. What you have in the last part of your packet is some examples of differentiating based on readiness, interest, and learning profile. And many of you have been going to sessions on raft assignments and learning contracts and tiered lessons, and you're seeing some of those. So hopefully, that will give you some additional examples as well as some of these that you can read. You feel it all like this little bird right now? Come to some rainy city and look around and they're talking about something that seems a little different from how life was Wednesday right before you left, or how it might be when you come back. And I really love this one. Here's the point that I want to make to you on this, guys. Teaching is a nomadic profession. There is no arrival point. We will be out in the desert looking for the better way 10 years from now and 15 years from now. The point really is to keep taking the journey, I think. Madeline Hunter said, if you want to feel safe and secure, continue to do what you've always done. If you want to grow, go to the cutting edge of our profession. Just know that when you do, there will be a temporary loss of sanity. So know when you don't quite know what you're doing, you're probably growing. If we ask you that, how many of you may have grown a little bit this week because you don't quite know what you're doing? That's really our best hope for you. I hope the rest of the day is excellent for you and that you have an opportunity to try a few things and think about a few things you've learned. Come chat if you'd like to.